Hi, everybody. Welcome back to section 2. Again, as with the previous section, if the content becomes too much, feel free to pause the video, take a break, and come back to this later on. So this video will contain lecture number 2 and activity number 2. So go ahead and get your scaffolded notes pulled back up, and let's dive back in. So the killing centers and other sites of mass destructions by early 1942, 75% of the 6 million who would be killed were still alive. By spring of the next year, that number will have flipped and 75% of them will be dead. Now, the idea of bringing victims to the killers really gained favor, made it really easy for the Nazis. And this is also accomplished under a plan known as Operation Reinhard, which 2 million people would be slated for death under this plan. So with this, there's a myth that we have to dispel. The mass killing of Jews was coordinated. In reality, it wasn't perfectly coordinated, nor was it even a clean process. It was characterized by a lot of improvisation and rivalry between the various camp leaders. So let's start diving in. We're going to go camp by camp, starting with Chelmno, located in territory taken from Poland and had originally been marked for Germanization. Now, within the nearby community, they found an abandoned castle that was unoccupied. They used this as their headquarters. Now, typically, trains would bring Jews in. They would be loaded into a van and driven to a courtyard on the other side of the castle. They would then be addressed by an SS officer and told that they were being sent to Germany to be Germanized. And they were told that they needed to take a shower first, but they were pushed into gas vans with about 90 people at a time. The vans would then be driven until they all died of carbon monoxide poisoning, with the survivors then being shot. The guards did keep some Jewish people alive to unload the corpses and bury the bodies. They are known as the Sonderkommando, or special unit. Typically, they would handle 12 to 13 vans or 1,000 bodies every single day. Now, typically, they wouldn't hold this position for long because when the next group of Jews would show up, the old ones would be killed off and replaced by new people. Now, by the spring and summer of 1942, the smell was everywhere. So they brought in ovens and ordered the Sonderkommando to dig up all the bodies that had been buried and cremate them. Now, in terms of the total killed, in general, we say about 145,000 people died at Chelmno, pretty much almost all of them being Jewish people. And then the camp closes in late 1942. Being reopened in 1944 when it was used to liquidate the population of the Lodz ghetto that we've talked about in previous lessons. Moving on to our next camp is Belzec. This is located in Poland. Number of survivors of this camp can pretty much be counted on one hand. And they began operation in March 1942. They're one of the 3 Reinhard camps that was established. They would officially become a killing center after the Wannsee Conference. Now, they had a fixed installation of gas chambers that utilized emissions from diesel engines. One of the major events of note that we need to talk about is on April 1st, 1942. This is the first day of Passover. The SS are going to bring more than 15,000 Jews to be killed from Lviv, that city we mentioned in the first part, to Belzec to be killed. In total, 400,000 Jews will be killed at Belzec, and the camp will officially close in spring 1943. My computer has decided to be a butt. Our next camp we're going to talk about is Sobibor, also located in Poland. For the most part, the major killing centers are all located in Poland. It was constructed solely to kill Jews, with its first commandant being Franz Stangl. This is the second of the Reinhard camps, with the total killed here being about 250,000. Now, a lot of people here that worked there, the perpetrators and onlookers, found ways to live with the knowledge of the mass killings. A lot of times, this idea that they were able to keep it secret doesn't actually exist. It's important to note that in October 1943, there will be a major escape attempt. Most will be recaptured, and the camp will then be closed shortly thereafter. The next other camp we need to talk about is Treblinka. This is the third of the Reinhard camps. This opened in July of 1942, and again in Poland. It was originally a forced labor camp about 80 miles from Warsaw. Its first victims were some 300,000 Jews from Warsaw specifically. We don't know a ton about what went there. We do have some quotes that we'll look at in a minute. But in total, 900,000 Jews and about 2,000 Roma will be murdered at Treblinka. They also did have a Sonderkommando numbering at about 800 Jews, and there's going to be a lot of people involved with the camp. I'm going to jump back real quick because that went ahead. The Sonderkommando did also include some women who completed domestic chores for the leadership. This also included men who were skilled laborers employed by the SS and people working the gas chambers, cutting hair, and handling bodies. This leads us into our first quote. So, Abraham Bomba was a barber at Treblinka. He, in his interview in Shoah, said that it was very hard to feel anything because working there day and night between dead people, between bodies, your feeling disappeared. You were dead. You had no feeling at all. So take a second, talk about this with your table partners. What do you think Bomba is talking about here? Now, our other quote we're going to look at about Treblinka is a really interesting one because the entrance to Treblinka was built like a traditional train station. People were really confused by this, with people like Adolf Eichmann, who we've talked about a couple times, agreeing that the train station looked like ones in Germany. So this is a quote from Chill Rashman. Now, Treblinka was built in a professional way. On arrival, it might appear to be an ordinary train station. The platform is long and wide enough to accommodate a normal train of as many as 40 cars. A few dozen meters from the platform, two barracks stand opposite one another. In one on the right is stored the food that people bring with them. The barracks on the left is where the women and children undress. The murderers are so considerate that they do not require the women to undress in the open air along with the men. On the way to their deaths, from which there is no return, men and women will meet intimately. So take a minute and think about how does this enhance your understanding of Treblinka? So in August 1943, there's going to be a pretty major revolt there. Prisoners are going to attack the SS, set buildings on fire, and escape into the nearby forests. Most will be recaptured, and only about 90 of those that escaped that day will actually survive the war. One of the other places we have to talk about in the camp is the infirmary. It's not a hospital, as the name would imply, but a site of killing. Children who arrived alone who got separated from their parents were typically sent here. They were shot on site. And it's very clear that no one in the area could be unaware of the killings. Like, they knew what was going on. Now, moving on to probably the one camp that you probably know the most about already, Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is the last site established as a killing center. It's also going to function the longest, if you've kind of been keeping track. All the camps we talked about so far closed after only a year, maybe two. Auschwitz is going to be one of the longest serving ones. It did originally start as a labor camp, with its first inmates arriving in 1940. These are Polish political prisoners, again, being in Poland. In summer of 1941, before the Wannsee Conference, it'll be transformed into a killing center, where there's actually a lot of experimentation. In September of 1941, they refined their methods and killed 900 Soviet POWs with Zyklon B, or rat poison, essentially. Now, by March 1942, Jews were going to be sent all over to be gassed, and it's important to know that this killing center specifically was known as Auschwitz II or Birkenau. A lot of times these camps have smaller camps that are known as like Treblinka II or Auschwitz II or Bergen-Belsen III, implying a different section of the camp. Also at Auschwitz, we have to talk about the monster, Joseph Mengele, a Nazi scientist and SS doctor who experimented on people, specifically people that were short, had twins, and others that meant a variety of things for his research. Typically, this meant very cruel and unusual punishments, and typically most of his experiments did kill the test subjects. One of the most notable ones involving twins involves taking the organ of one twin and putting it into another to see if the other twin dies. Now, when it comes to survival in Auschwitz, people were either chosen for work or to be killed, with those being chosen to be killed, including children, the elderly, women with children, pregnant women, the sick, and weak, and a bunch of other people. There was also tricks for the killing too. Typically, they were told they were going to take a shower, when in reality, they're being led to a gas chamber. Now, we actually have another quote, this time from Isabella Leitner, a Hungarian Jewish survivor who survived Auschwitz. She describes her experience at Auschwitz. She said, "Our heads are shaved. We look like neither boys nor girls. We haven't menstruated for a long time. We have diarrhea. No, not diarrhea. Typhus. Summer and winter, we have but one type of clothing. Its name is rag. Not an inch of it without a hole. Our shoulders are exposed. The rain is pouring on our skeletal bodies. The lice are having an orgy in our armpits, their favorite spots. Their blood sucking, the irritation, their busy scurrying give the illusion of warmth. We're hot at least under our armpits while our bodies are shivering." So take a minute and think about this, and how would you feel if you were in these conditions? It's important to note that this began the process of destroying their sense of themselves and went hand in hand with plunder at Auschwitz. So they had a storage area at Auschwitz known as Canada, of all places, um, where prisoners sorted through piles of personal items, including eyeglasses, suitcases, photographs, with the most valuable items going to the higher ups and typically their wives. Now, it's important to note this is before the mass production of goods, so clothes were actually pretty expensive and pretty well made. They're not like a shirt that you could go buy at Walmart and you'll see 10 other people wear at the same time. These are like one of a kind things, they're expensive, and they have value. There was also loads of shoes, with one person, Abraham Sutzkever, saying, "The cartwheels rush, quivering. What is their burden? Shoes, shivering. Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others." It's why at most Holocaust museums you will see giant stacks of shoes to help illustrate the point of those that died. So, like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, Auschwitz was the last and the largest of the killing centers. It also represented refinement. Officials bickered about conflicts here, and Auschwitz combined these efforts into one big thing. Now, again, like I've been hinting at, the ability to try and keep this secret doesn't happen. German authorities tried to restrict knowledge, but secrecy was impossible. Simply put, the operations were too big and it involved too many people to keep them quiet. Now, let's talk about the Roma real quick, because they also are involved in this. The killing centers marked the culmination of the process of destruction. 3 million Jews killed at the camps were mentioned. Um, that were mentioned earlier in the section of notes. The number of Roma killed is harder to determine because they didn't keep as concrete records. We do know at least that 20,000 were killed at Auschwitz, and it leads into an interesting conversation of Sinti versus Roma. Now, Himmler, we've talked about him a lot, was very fascinated by this, establishing an office known as the Racial Hygiene and Population Research Center, with about 30,000 Sinti in Germany being studied. The information they gathered here was then used to locate Romani people, arrest them, sterilize them, and kill them. Now, Himmler also wanted to go so far as to preserve some pure gypsies by putting them in a reservation or a zoo, with Germany providing generous funds to study them. It's also important to note that many shared similar experiences with the Jews that were in the camps as well. Within the camps, there was also a sexual economy that was used to gain supplies, with Zilli Schmidt in her memoir, and you can read that quote if you'd like, describing how she hooked up with somebody for the sake of getting better supplies and surviving. It also, this lack of information and the experience of Nazi persecution reveals how isolated the Roma were actually in Europe in the 1940s. Moving on to another camp that we need to talk about is Majdanek. Now, this one and the next one we're going to talk about, Theresienstadt, were developed in response to particular needs. They don't easily fit into any of the main categories that we brought up during the opening activity or have talked about previously. Now, they were labor camps combined with a mass depot for sorting passengers and sending them off to the other killing centers. Typically, this was also where they sorted possessions, And it was built in the winter of 1940 and 1941 for prisoners of war specifically. In July 1941, Germany is going to send Soviet POWs and over time add Polish people and political prisoners to the camp. In 1942, gas chambers will be built on site. And it's important to note that prisoners suffered terrible abuses, most POWs dying from starvation and torture, and the SS guards in, enjoyed the violence and tortured children in front of their mothers and played deadly sports as well. Like I said, many prisoners passed through here on their way to other destinations. Typically, Majdanek was used to hold Jews until space opened up elsewhere. There was a lot of violence at Majdanek. Adolf Eichmann actually will visit in 1942, and once there, the guards forced all the inmates to spend the entire day on parade, meaning standing at attention in a singular spot all day. Eichmann at one point said, "Get rid of the whole lot." So in November of 1943, 17,000 people will be killed. In total, 200,000 people will die in this camp, two-thirds of them being Jews. This was also one of the first sites liberated by the Red Army towards the end of the war, and it became a potent symbol for Nazi assault on the people of Eastern Europe. A lot of the evidence that will be used later on, in like the Nuremberg trials and stuff, came from here. So let's talk about Theresienstadt, also known as Terezin. Initially, it was sent more than 140,000 Jews, with a quarter of them dying there. Typically, it's important to note elderly people by nature have a higher death rate, with 87,000 people then being sent to the east from there. The camp served multiple purposes. It was meant to be a destination for Jews that were deemed to be exceptions to the killing rule, typically elderly German Jews and prominent individuals that might attract international attention if, they died. It also served as a propaganda function. It existed as proof that the camps were nothing more than labor camps, providing a convenient cover, and because it showcased the supposedly humane treatment of Jewish prisoners. The camp's even going to be visited by the International Red Cross twice. And it's simply going to do nothing more but perpetuate that, they're being humanely treated. There's nothing wrong going on here. When in reality, a lot of stuff was going down. So, our knowledge check, you're going to start filling out that graphic organizer for activity number 2. And while you do, consider the following. What was the experiences for those who were at the camps? So, activity number 2, you're going to fill out a graphic organizer about the camps we just discussed, using the information from your notes to answer the following. When the camp opened, where was it located? When did it become a killing center? When it closed, if it did close, and how many people died there? Once you fill out the graphic organizer, you're going to answer that reflection question at the bottom, answering, were there any elements shared among the camps discussed in lecture number 2? And here are the sources that were used for this lecture. I will see you all momentarily for section 3.